Good morning to the participants from the United States. Dear Alex, can you hear me? Perfect, thank you very much. And good afternoon to the participants from the wider European region. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this event. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to organize this event jointly with the United States Helsinki Commission. And I would like to welcome our guests who will contribute to the discussion today on the issue of policing in multi-ethnic societies. After opening remarks by two very distinctive speakers, Senator Ben Cardin, also serving as the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's Special Representative on Anti-Semitism, Racism and Intolerance, and Mr. Hilary Shelton, Director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we will have two panels. The first will look at the principles of policing in multi-ethnic societies. The second will aim at sharing some good practices in this field that could serve as a source of inspiration for others. Today's speakers come from very different backgrounds. The OSCE, including its parliamentary branch, is clearly well represented. Practitioners in the field of law enforcement and representatives of civil society will enrich the debate with specific expertise and viewpoints. I'm grateful you joined us today, and I thank you for your contribution. Over the course of the last year, the issue of policing in multi-ethnic societies has been brought to the forefront of the public debate. While increased attention devoted to this topic has been triggered by a number of events in the United States, the echo that the debate has enjoyed has gone beyond the United States, underlying the importance of this issue for diverse societies globally. Indeed, all over the world, ethnic diversity is the norm. Since the collapse of multinational empires after World War I in the wider European region, and then later with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, communities found themselves caught within new borders, effectively becoming minorities. Immigration has also changed the composition of many societies, and in the experience of successive high commissioners mandated to address tensions involving national minorities at the earliest possible stage, fostering the integration of society while respecting and valuing its diversity is one of the most effective strategies to secure peace and stability. All parts of the public administration have a role to play in this process. This is why, along with providing early warning at the first signs of potential inter-ethnic conflict, successive high commissioners have invested considerable resources in developing, promoting, and assisting the implementation of a set of policy recommendations in various thematic areas that are aimed at ensuring that everyone, irrespective of ethnicity, can recognize and realize themselves as part of the society in which they live. The OSCE participating states are the primary recipients of the High Commissioner on National Minorities advice. Not only are they the main responsible, according to international law, for the protection of the rights of the citizens residing within their borders, including minorities, but also the guarantors of the state's security and stability. Policing is one of those key sectors that can help social integration and cohesion. If equipped with the right tools, the police can play a crucial role in promoting relations across communities and identifying and addressing possible sources of inter-ethnic tensions. There have been, however, instances, especially in situations where structural imbalances impact access to rights and overall integration processes, in which minority communities have perceived the police as a tool of repression rather than protection, and have felt they were being disproportionately targeted as compared to majority communities. These sentiments risk creating a situation in which minority groups have no trust nor a stake in law enforcement, which is supposed to serve all citizens equally. This does not only undermine confidence in the police, but also in the state as a whole. It may push communities to rely on informal ties and personal networks for protection and basic security, which risks weakening the rule of law and challenging the sovereignty of the state. Notwithstanding these risks, the potential for the police and other law enforcement agencies to foster closer relations across communities, as well as confidence between those communities and the state, is huge. The High Commissioner's recommendations on policing in multi-ethnic societies, which will turn 15 next year, outline the necessary steps to leverage this potential. First, for everyone to feel that they have a stake in the police and to foster communication with all social groups. The composition of the police at all levels and ranks should reflect the diversity of society. This includes, among other considerations, ethnicity and gender. Secondly, it is essential that the law is enforced in an impartial and non-discriminatory manner, without inadvertently singling out any particular group. Perceptions also count. Tactics and appearances should be considered with a view to de-escalating tensions rather than provoking intimidation. Third, training is an essential factor in shaping a police force that is sensitive to diversity. Both senior and junior police officers should benefit from training opportunities that help them understand and respond appropriately to the sensitivities of minority groups. Fourthly, the use of force should be tightly regulated as per relevant provisions in international law and addressed in training and regular retraining courses. And lastly, accountability mechanisms should be in place for potential complaints. While law enforcement agencies, as the ultimate responsible for enforcing the law, should be committed to reform in line with these principles, they cannot be left alone in the process. States should be prepared to invest sufficient resources, not just in training, equipment, and human resources, but also by intensifying efforts in other complementary policy areas that can be of support of a police force that reflects and respects diversity. For example, they should pay attention to the language aspect by promoting mastery of the state language among police officers to facilitate their integration within the police force, as well as retention and promotion in the ranks, while ensuring linguistic diversity to allow for better communication with minority communities. Ladies and gentlemen, police reform cannot be considered in isolation. Societal integration and ultimately resilience to conflict will not be achieved if these changes are not part of an overall strategy that looks at society as a whole, identifies and addresses root causes of inequality and conflict. As the body of guidelines and recommendations that the High Commissioner on National Minorities has produced over the years clearly shows, the spectrum of policy areas that can, in combination, contribute to social integration is wide. The commitment and effort required is considerable, but the rewards in terms of peace and stability make it all worth. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm honored to pass the floor to Senator Ben Cardin. Sir, the floor is yours.
Well, Mr. Camp, first of all, thank you so much for those introductory comments. I think you've laid out the challenge and the common themes of what we can do together in a very coherent way. And I know this expert panelist that we have today will help us in reaching consensus as to what we need to do. On behalf of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, I really want to thank the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities for putting together this very timely discussion that is central to the principles of the Helsinki Final Act and presents challenges in each one of our member states. None of us are immune from the challenges of dealing with diverse societies and policing. I also want to acknowledge my good friend Hillary Shelton, who is with us today, one of the great civil rights leaders in the United States, has been in the battle in such an effective way over such a long period of time. I know that we have the right person to start us off on this discussion. In the past months, we have seen a rise of anti-racism protests and movements across the globe. However, there is nothing recent about the roots of systemic racism that were planted in our societies centuries ago. Through targeted action in the United States and throughout the OSCE region, this racism can be removed, root and branch. Addressing racism has long been a focus of my work as special representative on anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and as a U.S. Senator in the leadership of the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Simply because when we advance racial justice and civil rights, we strengthen the foundation which our democracies were established. It is for this reason that the U.S. Helsinki Commission has joined forces with the High Commissioner on National Minorities Office to hold today's event, following several hearings and other initiatives the Commission has advanced on international racial justice and human rights at home following the tragic death of George Floyd. In the past, I've said, before they first put on a badge, a police officer takes an oath to uphold the law. Most do so with the best intentions and carry out their duties with a willingness to help our communities. But in far too many communities around the country, the system in which they work has been failing. People are dying at the hands of police, predominantly people of color. Accountability has been tied to public videos rather than doing the right thing. Black lives matter, and we must do better to protect the civil rights, human rights, and lives of men, women, and children of our country and throughout the OSCE region. My state of Maryland has had numerous protests in response to the tragic police killing of George Floyd, Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, and other African American members of our community. In response, I've called for a federal civil rights investigation into the killing of George Floyd, and some years ago introduced the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act and the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. I co-sponsored the Justice and Policing Act in the Senate, which would combat police misconduct, excessive force, and racial bias in policing. The Justice and Policing Act legislation includes my End Racial and Religious Profiling Act and Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which has passed the House, but is stalled in the United States Senate. I've been proud to work with my House and Senate colleagues on this and other legislation that requires enhanced profiling data collection for our Justice Department, conditions state and local enforcement funds on combating profiling, and requires performance-based standards to ensure that instances of misconduct will be minimized through training and oversight. Other important provisions included in the Justice and Policing Act will save lives. The bill bans chokeholds by federal authorities and conditions federal law enforcement funds for state and local government on the adoption of chokehold bans. It also bans no-knock warrants in federal drug cases to address the tragic circumstances that led to the death of Breonna Taylor and others. Importantly, this legislation also calls for steps critical to demilitarizing our police forces. I have repeatedly said we are a civilian society, not a military state, and we must encourage more professionalism consistent with changing our police officers' mentality from a warrior mindset into a guardian mindset. This means limiting the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement and requiring federal uniformed police officers to wear body cameras. Finally, the legislation holds police accountable in courts and gives better tools to the Department of Justice and state's attorney generals to investigate and prosecute police misconduct. In 2016, the Department of Justice concluded that the Baltimore Police Department, the city in which I live, had targeted African American residents for disproportionate and desperate treatment, and that this widespread pattern of practice was illegal and unconstitutional. The United States District Court for the District of Maryland is now overseeing a complete overhaul of the Baltimore Police Department, which began in 2017. We have made progress since the tragic death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, 2015, but recent events indicate we have so much more work to do. These are examples of legislative and legal aims that could serve as a guide across the globe. I welcome today's event as an important opportunity to consider these and other practices that can improve law enforcement and its relationship with our communities. Communities working with police rather than against police is critically important to public safety and protection of civil rights. I've seen the extraordinary differences it can make when public leaders acknowledge past injustices and work to heal and repair the past and build safe and inclusive societies. I've seen how empowering communities to reimagine public safety in an equitable and just way can transform our societies. Mark Duggan in UK, Adema Traoré in France, Early Yellow in Germany are just some of the Black and minority European lives that have been lost to police killings over the past 2 decades, whose names have been recalled in recent protests. While Roma populations continue to be victims of unwarranted police raids and excessive use of force, sometimes resulting in death. From Russia to Canada, our country is not alone in confronting issues of discriminatory policing and racial injustice in the region. Working together with the High Commissioner's Office and other OSCE institutions, we can strengthen efforts to ensure racial justice and the protection of human rights for all as enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. I look forward to the panelist discussions, and I look forward to us coming to consensus how we can deal with this very challenging issue consistent with the commitments we've all made under the Helsinki Final Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Cardin. And it's now my honor to give the floor to Mr. Hilary Shelton. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I am deeply honored to be on this panel today as we go through the day to address many of the issues of police misconduct and other concerns as we work to address diversity within our law enforcement community. So a panel which will address issues of policing in diverse societies, principles, and good practices is absolutely necessary. I want to thank my good friend, Senator Ben Cardin, for his leadership here in Washington, D.C. and throughout our country. Sitting in the U.S. Senate, he's someone that has mustered the courage to raise issues that has put him in the crosshairs too often of controversy and disagreement from those that would like to continue business as usual. But his leadership in addressing issues like racial profiling and religious profiling in our country, his focus and courage to address issues of the use of force by law enforcement against local communities and individuals is something that should be commended. And we are grateful at the NAACP for its great leadership along those lines. As you may know, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is the United States' oldest and largest grassroots-based civil rights organization. As we look at the focus of the NAACP, some would think that we focus only on issues of the African-American community. But let me say from the very beginning, our leadership has been as diverse as the group of people gathered here today. We are African-American and white American. We are Jewish and Christian. We are Latinx. We are Native American. We are Asian American and others. In essence, as we recognized some 111 years ago, the NAACP is an organization that had begun as a very diverse focus on the issues and concerns of the American people, regardless of our differences, and continues to move in that direction as we do have units throughout the United States in every state in the United States, but also still on military bases in places like Italy, Germany, Korea, and Japan. So our focus has been consistent in addressing issues of equal opportunity and equal protection for all Americans. So having this discussion about policing today is absolutely crucial. I think Senator Cardin laid it out very clearly and very well as we looked at the dangers and the damages that have been done throughout our country. Unarmed African-American men and women finding themselves all too often in the crosshairs of police that decide that there is no limit to the level of force that they can use against them, deadly force very much at the front end. But we know these are concerns that can be addressed, and we're delighted that they're being addressed in this international forum. We know as we think about concerns of our communities that oversight is also crucial. So as we think about the discussions today, we want to make sure that we're thinking about issues of policy. Senator Cardin is absolutely right as he moves to utilize his authority to implement new policies to provide those protections and direction in which law enforcement should take not only in the United States, but quite frankly, I believe the policies that he has advocated for are very helpful being implemented in many other countries and communities as well. We're thinking about making sure the policies are in place for what is the acceptable use of force under which circumstances is crucially important. as we think about training our law enforcement officials to be able to carry out those responsibilities with that level of trust and integrity is also crucial. We've learned some hard lessons as I've spoken to every Attorney General of the United States going back to the very early 90s. In each case, whether male or female, in each case, whether black or white, in each case, regardless of differences and where they've come from, our political party affiliations, they all say the same thing. In order for us to have law and order in our country, we must have trust and integrity of law enforcement officials. And that's why the training is also crucially important. And finally, there must be clear oversight. We know that from the very beginning, as we're thinking about the oversight for the kind of screening is absolutely necessary as well. Our communities are quite diverse throughout the United States, but also throughout the world and the countries that many of you are from. When also think about that diversity, it's important that we have law enforcement officials that recognize and actually honor that diversity as well. Stereotypes need to be addressed, background needs to be addressed, and then accountability needs to be very much part of the day. That is, everyday people in our democratic societies must have power of oversight of law enforcement officials as well. So with that, I want to thank you again for what you're doing, for what's been going on with this particular agency, for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the High Commissioner on National Minorities, and everything that we'll be doing today to move these issues forward once again, raising them up, being careful in how we recruit people, the screening that's necessary to make sure that the right balanced people are in place to provide that oversight, and to make sure that as we look throughout our country and throughout the world, that the American people and people everywhere are able to have that level of trust and integrity, crucial for first preventing crimes, and then secondly, to be able to solve those crimes after they've been committed. So I thank you again, and I look forward to today's events.
Thank you so much, sir, for your contribution. I would like to immediately pass the floor on to Alex to open the first session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christoph. We have essentially 50 minutes to have a really robust discussion on our first panel. And we have an esteemed group of panelists and a number of issues to cover. As Christoph said, my name is Alex Johnson. I am the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, and I have the privilege of moderating this session. As we have heard, policing should reflect a contract of trust and safety among peers in a community. Policing cannot act as an occupation force that does not reflect the community that they serve. As the HCNM recommendations from almost 15 years ago asserted, policing systems from a perspective of personnel and practice should reflect the diversity of their societies, be it linguistic, ethnic, racial, religious, or any other asserted identity. As we've also heard, as Senator Cardin raised, as Mr. Shelton raised, we have challenges in the OSCE region. Policing systems remain that can reflect a dark legacy ranging from the fugitive slave codes in the United States, where some police forces were specifically established to reinforce slavery, or elsewhere in the historical abuse of police forces to implement other crimes in violation of fundamental freedoms in conflict zones, for example. Systemic challenges cascade into disparate impacts for already marginalized communities in our judicial systems. The fact is, our communities demand safety, and our international exchange of best practices can help us all reinvent how to ensure safety in our communities. We will have an opportunity to hear from our panelists to discuss the solutions and resources available to OSCE participating states to establish a contract of trust and inclusion. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists, beginning, of course, with one who needs essentially no introduction, and that is Ambassador Lamberto Zanier. Having most recently served as High Commissioner on National Minorities, he also has, of course, a storied career with the OSCE, serving as its Secretary General recently, as well as formerly the Director of the Conflict Prevention Center. He also served as UN Special Representative for Kosovo and head of the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo. As a career diplomat, he worked with the Italian Foreign Ministry in numerous countries throughout the OSCE region and beyond, and we're really glad to have him with us today. Second among our panelists is Ms. Anina Ceaușu. Ms. Ceaușu is a lawyer and an author of French and Romanian citizenship and of Romani origin. She has written a book which is called I'm Roma and I Remain, where she told her story about living in Europe and addressing some of the challenges that we are seeking to engage on today. Additionally, we will hear from some of her work as it relates to the accomplishment in which she was the first Roman person to run for national election in France, which was a tremendous accomplishment, and her work with the organization Ascola. Additionally, we have our list is Yulia Kurasheva. It's great to see her again. She has spent many years, since 2012, working with the Office of Democratic Institution and Human Rights, Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Unit, where she has coordinated the implementation of the Training Against Hate Crimes for Law Enforcement, or TACKLE initiative. She has storied experience in working with EU-funded projects and other international organizations, as well as the United Nations. So first, let's start with the lived experience of communities disproportionately impacted by these systemic problems in our policing systems. And then we will go into the nexus of the HCNM's mandate and policing in diverse societies, as well as the role of parliamentarians to shape national policies and standards in policing. Then we will conclude with a discussion of the tools implemented through ODIHR to address hate crimes and overcome profiling and discrimination in policing throughout the OSCE region. So first, the lived experience. We'll start with Ms. Ceaușu, please.
Hi.
Welcome.
So much. Alex, thank you. I would like to thank also the OSCE for according me the opportunity to meet and speak with you. So as you introduced me, I'm a lawyer, but I was also a member of Fraternity Observatory, that is a collective to observe the relationship between police and population in the suburb of Paris, that is a very diverse region in France. And in this collective, I had the occasion to work also with a representative of a national police union. And it was very interesting to have also his opinion on this very old issue of police brutality in France. And of course, the wave of mobilization on this issue coming from the US after the murder of George Floyd has a lot of repercussion in France. And we have seen that there was a massive mobilization in the last months because the issue of racist police brutality is an old secular and structural problem in France, and I am talking about structural problem, and is not only a moral problem of few individuals. Why I am telling structural? Because in France, according to a report coming from the Defender of Rights from 2017, when you are a Muslim, a Black, or a Roma man, you have 20 times more likely to be checked by police and 3 times more likely to be brutalized by police. In France, each year you have between 15 and 20 deaf people killed by police. And in 2019, we have more than 130 people injured and a lot of mutilation by police officers, especially during the demonstration, the public demonstration that we have in France in last year. in France also very few times we have the investigation following the police brutality acts are leading to a public trial, and very few, almost never, the police officers are convicted. So structural problem, but we have some principles, we have some recommendations that can structurally change the system to increase the confidence between people and police, and also to raise the tension growing in France on this matter. And we have several structural changes needed in France. First, when you have check police, control police, we need to install in France a receipt that is a proof that we have been controlled by police, and I think that is already existing in different countries, in UK, for example, and it's working. We need also in France to have an independent body to investigate about police violence, because it's not the case. Today we have a body that is a body from police officer that is in charge to investigate on act of police brutality. We need also in France to change to the law. There is a specific article L4000 in the Security Interior Code in France that is according a presumption of legitimate defense for the police officers. And of course, I think there is a big need also on the methods used by the police, that they are lethal methods, and I think about the ventral plaque, when the police officer is trying to stop people and coming on their back with the knees, and people have been killed through this method used by police. That is a very dangerous method. So I think also we need a very structural change on the training for police officers, because it's a crucial issue in France on several points. And this representative of National Union of Police Officers in France told me that, police officer was only trained to know how to kill people and not how to stop them. For example, when they are trained to shoot and to use their firearms, they are only trained to kill. So it's a big issue, and he was working, to put a training for on the use of violence by police officers, and I think that would be a very interesting structural change in France. So I think a few, most needed principles that I think France will really need it to work on the issue of police brutality and police violence in France. Thank you, and I'm looking for your question, and maybe we can talk a bit more about some specific aspects.
Great, thank you so much. We will open the floor for questions and discussion at the conclusion of all of our panelists, and hopefully at that time we can get more into some of your personal experiences and engagement, but we appreciate the recommendations of the French case in this instance. So second, of course, we will have contributions from and initial thoughts from Ambassador Zanier. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. As I started working with the Parliamentary Assembly in an advisory role, one of the things I did as we were starting to engage on the idea of contributing to this event, I asked one of our excellent researchers to, in fact, to do some research on statements, declarations, resolutions of the Parliamentary Assembly addressing this point. And I was, I have to say, surprised to see how many there have been. Beginning back, and I will quote some, beginning back in 2002, where a resolution on prevention of torture, abuse, extortion, or other unlawful acts, where it says, concerned that race or ethnicity may be used instead of actual evidence as a means of targeting minorities for steps, searching, investigation, arrests, and convictions, and believing that some practices severely erode community confidence in police and other enforcement bodies, and then condemns the practice of racial profiling and encourages OSCE to build upon his work to ensure human rights protection becomes an element of police cadet training. And then so many others. I mentioned just a few. Washington 2005, encouraging participating states to establish parliamentary oversight for law enforcement agencies. Kiev 2007, train law enforcement officers and military personnel to interact with diverse communities and address hate crimes, including community policing efforts. Monaco 2012, calling the OSCE to adopt a strategic framework for police-related activities based on promotion of democratic policing principles. Helsinki 2015, called participating states to hold a high-level conference to address, to develop an OSCE action plan to address racial justice, including adopt its laws, policies, and practices to end discriminatory policing in the wake of numerous deaths by law enforcement of people of African descent and others across the OSCE region. Tbilisi 2016, developing integration strategies in the context of building capacity of police and law enforcement professionals, including utilizing the work of the HCNM and the Ljubljana Guidelines of Integration of Diverse Society. So in there was a clear reference to the HCNM experience. And the last Berlin 2018 call for ending discriminatory policing in the wake of numerous deaths caused by law enforcement officers of people of African descent, migrants, refugees, Muslim, and others across the OSCE, and calls on OSCE participating states to engage in necessary reforms in order to eliminate practices of discriminatory and excessively violent policing. I apologize if I took time to go through all this, but I think it's important. I'll tell you why in a minute. Coming to the work of the High Commissioner, one of the constraints that the High Commissioner has, and this is pointed out in the introduction to the policing recommendations of 2006, is that the mandate extends to cover national minorities. And counting them to, how can I say, object, some more than others, in fact, to activities of the High Commissioner that extend beyond this definition, which is a definition that countries reserve to themselves. So it's not really open for discussion of national minorities. So what we heard now from Anina, for instance, in that case, we could not apply the recommendation of the High Commissioner because France says we have no national minorities in France. That is a concept that is not really recognized by the French Constitution. So I think it is important to find ways to ensure that these excellent recommendations of the High Commissioner that touch every aspect of police operation in relation to diversity in the societies, of course, to minorities primarily, should be really extended to diverse societies as such. As societies have everywhere grown more diverse. This is where the Parliamentary Assembly could also play a role. And if I can move now to a more operational mode, one of the possibilities could be maybe to find some parliamentarians who could, just as a first step, request the inclusion of a supplementary item on this topic at the next, perhaps at the next winter meeting already, where there should be as much as possible an endorsement of the recommendations of the High Commissioner on policing, and the 21st anniversary of this recommendation next year is an excellent opportunity for that. and adding that these should be applied to diverse societies. As societies have evolved and as we have seen this problem repeatedly, as has been pointed out in many resolutions, and here this is why the importance of the reference. Many Assembly, this should be recognized, and these recommendations can be an excellent tool to address issues no matter where in the OSCE space when it comes to police operating in diverse environments. The second consideration I would put forward is that these recommendations and declarations call for a number of actions, but often in the OSCE we are a bit weak in monitoring the implementation of statements of these kinds, no matter how important they are. So this is another area where we could come together from different directions, the Parliamentary Assembly itself, and maybe if these things end up on the agenda of the various sessions at some point, there could be also a review of the implementation and see how much progress has been made in terms of legislative action by parliaments, etc., on these issues. The High Commissioner can provide input by sharing advice, information, assessment based on its own activities and following the focus and increased focus that as of next year they will have on police activities and report on that. The SPMU, the Senior Police Matters Unit in the Secretariat, could also, with a strong focus on community policing, contribute to this. So strengthening the synergies within the organization. And the history is not very, how can I say, very positive on this, or there is space for improvement. I remember, for instance, when the police operation in South Kyrgyzstan, the community security initiative, took place. The High Commissioner that had expertise on this was not really consulted, even though this was a police operation taking place in a minority area and where the minority-majority relation were the key issue from a policing point of view. So interaction within the organization and better synergies, I think it would be important. The other point that, and the final one that I could raise, is that as next year we have the 15th anniversary of the recommendations, we could consider together with the HCNM and the others, and perhaps in formats similar to this, joint initiatives where these ideas could be promoted. Where, first of all, we can help expand as much as possible these principles of the High Commissioner to apply them to society as a whole, so that this debate can start in the Parliamentary Assembly, but also then spill over into on the intergovernmental side, and encourage through whatever initiatives, whether it's security days or other initiatives that the Swedish chairmanship might consider, but giving a stronger visibility, first of all, to these recommendations, also with the contribution of everybody, and secondly, trying really to make an effort to have them more universally recognized, so that various institutions, and I failed to mention ODIHR, and ODIHR, of course, also has a strong role in this context, can take them into account as they operate with all participating states, and not only with the ones who officially recognize certain groups as minorities, and therefore to whom these things would be applied. So I would leave it at this, but I'm happy then to continue discussing these ideas as we proceed. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Zanier. I think, as you can see from our list of participants, we have so many experts and parliamentarians, for that matter, who could help in terms of the recommendations that you had indicated of potentially having a supplementary item in the next annual session and gearing up to recognize that anniversary. But you also raised a really important point about synergies within OSCE institutional structures, engaging, for that matter, the Special Police Matters Unit and others in terms of how we can engage on this particular issue of policing. So with that, we're going to turn to our last panelist, who will really operationalize some of those recommendations. Ms. Korasheva, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to the host for organizing this timely event on such an important topic. I would like to focus on policing approaches that integrate and respect diversity and help to prevent bias-motivated incidents and violent manifestations of intolerance. Actually, this is exactly the approach that we use in ODIHR's training for law enforcement that Alex mentioned in the beginning, our TACKLE program. But I will start with the recruitment and representation in the police. Recruiting police officers from the national minorities and other marginalized communities is crucial to establish the connection with these communities. Law enforcement needs people who are familiar with culture, with traditions, with habits, and languages of various communities. Also, it is important to encourage more women, and especially women from national minorities, to enter the field of law enforcement. However, often reaching out to the communities, recruiting to the police force, and training of new cadets requires development of new policies, action plans to implement these policies, as well as decisions and approvals from the highest levels in the government, which usually, as we all know, takes time and often meets a lot of obstacles. We at ODIHR are very well positioned to advise to the government and provide them with examples and best practices. But there are other steps that can be taken to build better relations with national minorities and other communities. Connecting to and engaging with the communities is a key. We at the Tolerance Non-Discrimination Department work a lot with civil society organizations and vulnerable communities when collecting data for our annual hate crime report. And I can say that representatives of the communities would rather go to a police officer who they know, who will take their report, who will take their issue seriously, who language service is provided, and who will understand the needs of the victims and provide necessary support. Seeing familiar faces within the police is important for communities to come forward and report incidents to build trust between police and vulnerable communities and victims. From my experience, and I have talked to many victims of discrimination and hate crimes through my work, victims of bias-motivated crimes often do not go to the police. Why? They might be afraid of police, or they might be afraid of discrimination from the side of police due to their previous experiences. They sometimes are afraid that the police will laugh at them or even abuse them. They're afraid of retaliation. They doubt if the issue is serious enough. They sometimes don't know what to do, or they even blame themselves for what happened, and there are many other reasons why. So the solution here is community-oriented policing, and often the engagement can start without costly campaigns, promotions, and complicated policies. Let me give you one example. Belgium, Antwerp local police. They have a special mediation team which consists of about 45 police officers. So during particular events, like for example, Ramadan, this team, they reach out to the communities, in the given case to the Muslim community. And if I remember right, there are like 16 mosques in Antwerp. So they visit all of these mosques and they talk to the religious leaders, imams, and to the people who are responsible to the security. They introduce themselves. They check out what's going on in the community, if there are any fears, if there are any threats, how they can help. They explain how they work. They leave a phone number and tell them what to do if the emergency situation happens. So basically every year they re-establish the contact, and if something happens, people within the community, they know where to go and who will help them. And to support the importance of collaboration between criminal justice bodies and communities, ODIHR has developed 2 practical guides, one on understanding anti-Semitic crimes and the other one on understanding anti-Muslim hate crimes and addressing the needs of these communities, which is actually based on cooperation between communities, law enforcement, and other relevant governmental institutions to work together on the security needs of Jewish and Muslim communities. Next point, proper pre-service and in-service training is another necessary principle for policing in multi-ethnic societies. training for police on inter-ethnic relations, minority issues, diversity and inclusion, anti-discrimination, hate crimes is necessary to ensure that police understand and respond appropriately to any rising issues. Police officers should know the peculiarities of working in diverse societies. They should know their communities and their needs. They should be aware of their own stereotypes and bias and make sure that any action or approach are bias-free. Police should always remember about the impact of bias-motivated incidents and hate crimes, that it is not only about one particular victim, but it's also about victim's family, victim's community, and it can affect the whole of society. Hate crimes pose a threat to security and stability, and they can escalate and affect larger groups of people, and they can even lead to inter-ethnic conflicts. And as mentioned earlier, ODIHR can assist participating states with training police on hate crimes. As mentioned before, it's our TACKLE program. And to ensure the comprehensive approach, we also have similar program for prosecutors, and we also train civil society organizations to ensure that they all work together on the issue. We need to remember that hate crimes usually attempt to send a message to victims and their communities that they are not welcome here and they do not belong to this society. The role of the police is to send a message back to the perpetrators and their communities, saying we will not tolerate hate crimes, and a message to the victims and their communities saying we take this case seriously, we care about your safety and security. Because, as I said, if not addressed properly, hate crimes can create a divide in a society and it may escalate to a larger conflict. And my last point, as we're talking about victims of bias-motivated violence, let's not forget that police are required to deal with victims' needs in an individual manner based on individual assessment, as it is actually stipulated in the EU Victims' Rights Directive. A victim-centered approach implies having a victim's needs and rights in the center of any action undertaken by criminal justice bodies and other entities involved. Ensuring that the needs of victims are met and that they are able to play an active role throughout the criminal justice process is not only beneficial for victims themselves. A victim-centered approach can help avoid secondary victimization and improve victims' trust in police, encouraging victims to report their cases and cooperate more closely and actively with criminal justice bodies. This, in turn, can help law enforcement to better understand the security needs in their communities and can further improve the efficiency of the criminal justice system. And on this topic, I highly recommend checking out rather new ODIHR's project on enhancing stakeholder awareness and resources for hate crimes victim support. Let's not forget that the role of the police is to protect all people and to create safe environment for all people, regardless of their personal views of any group. Thank you, and I'm looking forward for discussion.
Thank you so much, Ms. Koryasheva. I think as we've heard from your remarks, it really takes us back to the 2006 recommendations, especially where your work addresses both Principle 4 in terms of the operational practices that are important, which I know our next panel will go into in more detail, but also in Principle 3 or Recommendation 3, the key thoughts about how training and professional development are essential to address some of these challenges. So with that, we essentially have about 20 minutes for discussion, which I think is rare in this virtual world in terms of opportunities and events like this. I would like to hear from the audience in terms of questions for our participants, our panelists, or just even interventions and other thoughts. If you can help me by using the WebEx platform to raise your hand, and then I will know to be able to call on you to engage in discussion with some of our panelists. After we have our discussion, we'll offer a few minutes for each of our panelists to leave us with some parting thoughts. So with that, I open the floor. Are there any requests for the floor at this stage? And that can also be from our panelists if they would like to respond to some of their colleagues on the panel. So I'm not seeing any hands raised at this stage. It would also be phenomenal to hear from some of the parliamentarians who have joined us. Great. All right. Please, Ms. Karapatian.
Yeah, so I unmuted my microphone. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I would like to thank the organizers of the event and all of the panelists for their initial input. To start my commentary on today's topic, I would like to offer us to take a couple steps back and maybe define a bit from a philosophical perspective some of the terms that we're dealing with today. Besides being a politician, a parliamentarian, my first vocation is conflict studies. So I want us to look at what the concepts of diversity and minorities mean, and what the concepts of conflict mean, and what the police in general is created by human societies. I want to make the argument also coming from a society that is largely considered homogeneous. You know, Armenia does not have a big number of national minorities. We do have communities of Yazidis, Kurds, Ukrainians, other identities living together as citizens of the Republic of Armenia, but we're considered homogeneous from a certain perspective. I want to make the argument that it's not only about these conventional ways of imagining homogeneity or diversity, that even countries that are ethnically considered homogeneous do have a lot of diversity in them just because people are different. And in general, human societies do have a conflict potential. And this conflict potential, of course, might vary based on the level of diversity in society, but you know, people invent others sometimes where there are no others, across economic division lines, across other social categories. So I think it is how we need to conceptualize this concept of diversity to widen it, to be attentive and sensitive to all sorts of manifestations, so that when we are confronted with the more conventional forms of how we conceptualize diversity, we're ready for this. When we talk about the police and its mission, it was created by human societies, obviously, as the actor of the legitimate use of force. And what we need to do here is to make sure that it doesn't turn into state violence, and that this body is constantly guided by the paradigm of human rights, if nothing better than that, at least the paradigm of human rights, and that it is either blind to the different characteristics of people, so everybody gets treated the same, or sensitive to these differences, so that when confronted with cases when people have a trait that is usually perceived as a vulnerability, then the police can be sensitive to this. My participation in today's webinar would be ethically wrong if I were not also to draw your attention to a development in the region where my country is located. You know, it's the 10th day today that we are going through a new phase of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and what we're living through is Cold War by all conventional means since September 27, following the attack that the president of Aliyev launched against Nagorno-Karabakh. The people of Nagorno-Karabakh and the people of the Republic of Armenia are coming under attack. And I want to remind us all that the origins of this conflict are also about the mistreatment of minorities within the larger structure of the Soviet Union, the lack of the pursuit of social, economic, political, cultural rights of the minorities, and in particular in the Republic of Soviet Azerbaijan, then led to an escalation and mismanagement of conflict and state violence against the Armenian minority living in Nagorno-Karabakh. that led to this conflict that we are unable to resolve for 3 decades, just because we can't address the origins of this conflict properly. I mean, the Azerbaijani side won't refrain from the use of force, won't acknowledge the origins of the conflict, and here we are again caught in this new cycle of this unbearable. My whole generation has basically been raised through this conflict, and I just don't see any hope at the end of this dark channel of war. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ms. Karapetian. Hopefully we can, through our discussion, find some hope, I believe. I think first, before I see a hand physically raised by Ms. Agahayeva, I think first we'll go to you, and then we'll see if any of our panelists would like to respond to some of the comments that were raised. Please, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, moderator, dear colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here today and to discuss this important topic with you. I also wanted to speak on this topic and share the policy and experience of Azerbaijan, the country I represent. However, the image of my country has been wrongfully accused by our Armenian colleague here, and I am compelled to make the following comments. Frankly speaking, it was not my intention to speak under these made-up groundless accusations. Or our Armenian colleagues are always addressing different accusations to Azerbaijan side. Whatever we express here, we should know one thing for sure, that it's impossible to change the historical facts. We should not deny them. Beginning with the historical facts regarding the establishment of the Armenian state and the occupation of the Azerbaijani lands by Armenians, ending with the today's speech by our Armenian colleague. And I have to mention that forcing other people to hear the false information is an obvious example of disrespect. You all are aware that nowadays Azerbaijan's army has been liberating Azerbaijan's occupied territories by the Armenian armed forces. I'd like to remind that in 1993, when Armenia occupied part of our territories, the United Nations Security Council adopted 4 resolutions demanding immediate, full and unconditional withdrawal of their troops from our territories. But what we see, Armenia demonstrates an open ignorance of the norms and principles of the international law. And yesterday and the day before yesterday, Armenian armed forces had shelled Azerbaijan's second biggest city, Ganja. One of the reasons why I drew your attention to the particular attack lies in the fact that the 77-year-old resident of Ganja, Cardin Grigorian, who is as a result of this Armenian war crime. Now, those are 2 neighboring countries. While Azerbaijan ensures the peaceful life conditions for its Armenian population, the Armenian military aggression causes great damage to their health and property. By attacking Ganja from Armenian territory, not from Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia is trying to provoke Azerbaijan to respond and target not just occupied territories, but this time Armenia's own territory. In addition to this, the head of separatist regime in Nagorno-Karabakh has announced on his official Twitter account that military objects in major cities of Azerbaijan will be their new target. Turning a blind eye to Armenia's illegal activities, belligerent statements, and aggressive actions by international community seriously undermines prospects of peaceful settlement. And once this policy of double standards and selective approach will be ceased, I'm sure there will be a basis for genuine dialogue. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, please conclude. Well, thank you so much. We do want to make sure that we keep our comments germane to our discussion here. We are very aware of the ongoing conflict, and we are, of course, it is unfortunate, but let's please try to keep comments germane to our discussion in terms of policing here. We do have an opportunity for our panelists to respond to some of the thoughts, I believe, going back to Ms. Karapetian's remarks on policing specifically. So if anyone would like to respond from the panel, before we proceed to the subsequent events. Mr. Zanier, please.
Yes, a couple of points just to comment on it that come up in the discussion. First of all, the prevention of conflict, I would say that is it's a fundamental consideration. This is very much at the basis of the mandate of the High Commissioner, which is a conflict prevention tool, and this is in recognition of the fact that if you don't manage properly interethnic relations, you create tensions within the society that will develop into crisis and conflict. So you need to look at those drivers within the society, but also within governmental policies that have an impact on that. This is why I think these guidelines of the High Commissioner on Policing are particularly useful in that context. And in fact, if you look well, there is even a chapter on conflict prevention inside the guidelines. So that I think should be a starting point of the discussion, and a clear also objective for the work that is done in this area. The second point is that these recommendations are very, in a way, very inclusive, very comprehensive as such. They talk about recruitment and the composition of the police force, so making points in terms of make sure that the composition of police reflects the diversity of the society. So the police should look like the society looks, and then it will be more credible and, as it has pointed out, more effective. The second issue is the training, and make sure that you invest in giving appropriate training to the police. In the point that Anina was raising, the police are trained to shoot, but they are trained to mediate. It's very worrying. So this is the kind of things that we should jointly, from all the angles of our activities, be promoting. And then specifically learning how to engage with communities, because communities are different. They have different cultural models, and you need to, and this is why diversity is important in the police, because then you will have policemen who know community better than others, and they know how to engage with that specific community. But this is not enough in itself. You also need to make sure that there is a better understanding, a better awareness of this kind of problems within the police force, and there is, and this is translated into operational procedures and policy frameworks. So I think there is a lot of work to be done. And one of the things that maybe we should aim at discussing towards the end of this is to see how we can all together make sure that there is a action on all of these points, and that participating states, in fact, do hear these comments and do respond to them and take action in response to them. So I think that will be the challenge of this panel, in developing a bit of a strategy for the OSCE institutions as such on addressing these issues and making sure that there is a response by the participating states.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. Any of the other panelists would like to briefly respond? I know there was points raised about how policing should really be tied to the guiding principles of human rights and how it's implemented. Any of our other panelists before we proceed to the list? Ms. Chachu.
Yeah, I will come back to the previous remark of Ambassador Zanier. He told that France doesn't recognize any of minorities living in France, and it's true. But maybe we can reflect on this principle and this constitutional principle also, because there is quite a reflection in France about the fact to recognize the diversity of French society and recognize the diversity as a consequence of French history, because it is a consequence of French history that we have very diverse population in France. But also what I wanted to mention, that any of the recommendation I have said previously For example, the creation of an independent body to control police activities, or the changes in the law that are needed to suppress the legitimate defense of the presumption of defense for police officers. Any of the changes and the recommendation I have explained before are not designed, are not targeted for minorities people. They are general structural changes that will benefit for all the population and for the mainstream population. And I think that also is a point that can be interesting because, and particularly in France, we know that we made these structural changes to improve the police institution, and the confidence of the population in police institution will benefit, of course, for the minorities that are targeted by brutality, police brutality, but also for the mainstream population. And that I think it's interesting to remark that and to outline that, because it will, it will in fact the need of the changes that we are asking for. Because it's not only a matter for minorities people, but it's for the whole society, for the mainstream society, that will improve the relationship between, our institution and one of the most important of them, that police institution, and the others. And also just to answer, because I have a question in the chat about what could be this independent body that will be able to control police activity. I think we can create, a constitutional body like the Defender of Rights. I think we have several countries that have this constitutional body that can ensure law enforcement about human rights, and it can be a constitutional body that will have the specific mission to control police activity and to investigate on these cases and to lead them to public trial, because it has to, it has to follow the normal process of justice, because there is a big need of justice in France particularly, but also in the other countries that people are here today in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chachi. In the interest of time, as we draw to a close of our session, we have 3 requests for the floor. We will take each of those interventions germane to this particular session specifically. And so we will start with Mr. Kalishnikov from the Russian mission, Mr. White, and then conclude with Mr. Danielian before any final thoughts from our panelists. So please, Mr. Kalishnikov, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all the speakers for the brilliant contributions to our discussion. To cut my intervention short, just very short comment and 2 questions. One of our speakers mentioned that negligence of minority rights for minorities may lead to conflict. Yeah, we have seen this situation or this kind of sample in some European countries, EU countries, OSCE countries, when politicians and authorities, they have been neglecting minority rights in some cases for decades. I can recall an example of so-called non-citizens in some countries, European countries, and we have another example when politicians neglected linguistic rights of national minorities or ethnic groups and the identity rights, which has already led to internal conflict. Those 2 examples will be enough to show the gravity of the situation in the OSCE area. And in this regard, my question goes to Mr. Shelton, who mentioned in his speech stereotypes that should be tackled or addressed somehow, since this kind of behavior by politicians, it's a kind of stereotype which leads to police to follow those stereotypes. So my question is, what should be done to break this chain of stereotypes to address these national minority issues? And second question, very briefly, goes to Ms. Yulia Korucheva, if I'm not wrong. She mentioned in her speech that those two guide publications on Muslims and Jewish communities. So my question is, do you have any plans to publish the same review or research on Christians, which is one of the most affected, I wouldn't say minority, it's a majority groups in Europe? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kalishnikov. And we will reserve responses to the questions, and we will, even though he's not a panelist, of course, we will allow Mr. Shelton an opportunity to engage. But first, let's collect the questions and comments from the field. And next, Mr. White, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and great job, by the way. A couple of points I wanted to make. We talk about levels of oversight for policing. I think many countries have been successful at implementing colleges of policing, and I'm not referring to police colleges, but an organization that would represent interests other than the police, and as well, often codifying recruiting, training, use of force, representation within policing. As an example, in Canada, there was a legislative decision in 1984 that all police agencies would be representative of those we serve, and yet not one police agency in this country has been successful 30 plus years later. So I think having a college of policing that we've seen in a number of countries successful would also be successful in a number of our countries. I think representation truly is one of the areas where I think something can be done and will have an immediate impact on the response between the police and the communities. I worked in the Arctic of Canada for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 19 years, and trying to represent the Inuit or First Nation groups was something we didn't do as well as we should have, and the impact has been seen as a result, negatively, I'm afraid. The second part I just want to throw out was the fact that between about 1995 and today, most police agencies have taken on new roles within the community that are not traditional police roles, like responding to mental health calls for service. In Canada, 20+% of all police calls are well-being checks for mental health, which are non-criminal in nature. And a lot of our negative interaction with the public comes from those calls. I think there needs to be, after the deinstitutionalization of mental illness, in the 90s, I think there needs to be a revisiting as to what we expect the police to do, and actually identifying that those actions are what we intended in the first place. So just comments, but I do appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate the co-host for managing this group. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. White, for your points. We'll briefly have an intervention from Mr. Danielian, and then final words from our panelists and Mr. Shelton. Mr. Danielian. Unfortunately, we still can't hear you, and your microphone is still off. We're not hearing any audio for you, Mr. Danielian. Okay. Unfortunately, there's no signal, so we can't hear your connection. So we will unfortunately have to proceed, and maybe you type in a question in the chat. Now, to be sensitive to our next panel, let's turn to our first, Mr. Shelton, for a brief right of reply, then final words from our other panelists. I would say, of course, we talked about, in terms of the questions that were raised, issues associated with what's next. What do we do from here? Mr. Shelton?
No, thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. The stereotypes are crucially important as we're looking at how people are treated and responded to by police officers. A couple of things we recommend as solutions. Number one, academic assessments of stereotypes are crucial too. We know those stereotypes are there. We know how some groups talk about other groups out of ignorance and sometimes out of intolerance. So that kind of assessment should be very much a part of police training. so they understand the diversity of the communities they're serving and the stereotypes, most untrue, that are utilized oftentimes to dehumanize groups of people along those lines as well. Secondly, the issue of accountability. As the stereotype is understood, police officers have to be held accountable if they begin carrying those issues forward. I've spoken to some extraordinary police officers that do incredible training at police academies, and they pointed out that the academies don't necessarily teach those stereotypes. But one of the biggest challenges is for a new police officer that has recently been trained, oftentimes placed in a police car with a seasoned police officer, so to speak. And as the story is told, when that new rookie is put in that police car, the first thing the well-trained and seasoned police officer says to them is, turns and says, look, we know what you were trained in that police academy. Forget everything you know. Let me teach you the stereotype and how you should carry out your responsibilities on the streets. Those issues are crucially important as well. Last point I'll make is the issue of recruitment, recruiting diversity in the communities that are being served. No one knows and understands those communities better than those that come from those communities. It's important that we recognize the need for a diverse police department that has the experience of growing up in those communities, trained to make sure those stereotypes are actually weeded from any assessment and how they're carrying out their duties and moving forward along those lines. Hope that was quick, Mr. Johnson. Thank you very much for the opportunity to respond. If you'd like, you can go on our website. Some of this information is there as well at naacp.org. And of course, anytime the commission would love to have me come back, I'd be just delighted.
Thank you so much, Mr. Felton. It's great to see you as well. Let's please proceed to any final short responses from our panelists, and then we will start with we could start with Mr. Zanier. Any final thoughts or words in response to any of the questions that were raised?
Yes, I would like to return to the issue of implementation of these recommendations of these policies by looking at the role that each of us and each of the institutions represented in this webinar can play. And of course, this is a place for brainstorming. So in that mode, I would venture to suggest that perhaps we should look at something new, something innovative, like a kind of interinstitutional cluster working group desk, however you want to call it, where we can, in the OSCE, compare notes periodically on the progress, on the problems that we find, the degree of access. On the issue of degree of access, I felt a bit sorry that I put France on the spot, but that was an example that I was prompted by Anina's comments. But there are quite a few countries that do that. And there are, on the other hand, countries, and just to pick some of the two big players in the OSCE, the US and Russia, in both cases, as I was operating as High Commissioner, I had full access. I had a meeting with Hillary Shelton in Washington a year and a half ago, and we discussed issue of policing in relation to his communities. And this was facilitated by the US government. And in Russia, I traveled to Tatarstan, and I had similar discussions with people there, even though none of these comes under the definition of a national minority. So with some openness, whereas I found countries, I'm sorry to say on the comment of Mr. White, when I was planning to join the summer, which of course was cancelled because of COVID, but the summer meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly in Vancouver, and I approached the Canadian representatives, governmental representatives, to have some contacts with the First Nation representatives. They told me rather bluntly, these are not national minorities, so you cannot. So I think it would be important also at the parliamentary level to work to give more access and to give more support to the institutions when they can play a useful role in helping, providing advice and solving some problems that in many cases are politically sensitive, intractable. But our mandate are built within the organization exactly to deal with politically sensitive issues, and we have ways of doing it in a way that is constructive and that should be appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. As we are already over time, fortunately, some of the questions are essentially aimed at the next panel in terms of some of the practitioners. I do want to give a final opportunity for Ms. Chowchu and Ms. Kordasheva to offer any parting thoughts, and then we'll move to our next panel. Ms. Chautu first.
Thank you. As a final remark, I just want to say that currently in France there is a very tense context. As you know, we have a very recent law against separatism that has been voted. In fact, there is a law against Islamic radicalization or something like that, but it's very targeting Muslim people. And it has been created a lot of tension in the French population. So I think that we really need in France to work on the issue of police relation with the population and to increase the confidence in the police, because if not, we risk to have some conflicts. And I think one of the first steps to work and to progress and to improve this issue will be for France to recognize that there is an issue, because as you have said, Mr. Ambassador Zanier, sometimes some states refuse to recognize the issue. And if you don't recognize the issue, you cannot solve it, you cannot find a solution. But we hope to have also some help from OSCE and from the different organizations that are here gathering this webinar to improve on this issue in France, because we are on the ground a lot of organizations and a lot of community organizations that are working on this issue of police population relationship and police brutality. But we quite need also some solidarity and help from the bigger organization to sometimes, remind to the states that they are bound by some human rights principles, and they have also to take a step back and reflect about their current situation and the current structural position, and something it can be good, to have this help coming from OSCE, for example. So we're looking forward to work on this issue on the future and maybe to improve it. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and it was a pleasure to share.
Thank you for joining us on the panel. Final thoughts on how to access resources, Ms. Korcheva.
Thank you very much. But first of all, I would like to answer the question from the Russian Federation, from Mr. Kalashnikov, regarding the practical guide. Yes, at ODIHR we have two practical guides, as I said. One is related to the Jewish community, the other one to the Muslim community. As to the Christians, we definitely work on intolerance against Christians and members of other religions, and we have a special with these issues and lots of programs and stuff. But the guide for now, it is something to consider in the future. But as final remarks, I would like to say the following. It was mentioned that it is important to know the diversity within within the society, even in places which seem to be homogeneous. And it is crucial that criminal justice bodies are aware of this diversity and they know their communities. They do their job properly, including prevention, investigation, and prosecution without prejudice, without bias. They know their stereotypes, so they do not use them in their work. And as some of the police officers who I work with say, address potential issue during peace, prevent, and it will save you lots of time, resources, and efforts in the future. And police must follow a human rights-based approach. A respect for fundamental human rights is essential for justice and to guarantee the security and safety to individuals and communities. And I would like to remind that we at ODIHR are there to assist all participating states in dealing with these issues. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. And now we thank all of the panelists for their phenomenal contributions. we will shift the discussion, and hopefully there's, as you can see, a lot of continuity with the topic of the next panel. I pass on the moderation duties to Ms. Denise Mazzolani, the Deputy Head of the OSCE Strategic Police Matters Unit. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, and thank you. I'm really honored and glad to be with you today. And I really would like to thank the High Commissioner National Minority and the U.S. Helsinki Commission for the invitation to moderate this panel, because I think we need this kind of discussion and we need more in the framework of the OSCE. And why? Just to share, before giving the floor to our experts, to share a few experiences that the Strategic Police Matters Unit had in working with OSCE participating states in several processes of police reform. And few issues were already highlighted. I'm referring, for example, to Mr. Shelton when he clearly indicated integrity and accountability of the work of the police. And of course, it's really true that we need a strong oversight system, an external and independent system. But what we are witnessing, and we witness in working with our participating states, is also the functioning of the internal control system of the police, or as you want to, the sector for internal control or department, depending on the countries. This is really crucial. And also when it comes to representations of national minorities in the services, in the police service, sometimes we really are a bit superficial in the sense that we tend to look at the number and we are identifying immediately the community policing service, the patrolling system, but we need really to go a bit deeper and to see at senior level, are they well represented? Are they included, again, in the sector for internal control, which usually in some countries is still inside the police system? So these are really issues that we in the SPMU we are facing, and we think that focusing on also the functioning of this system would be really crucial to improve the entire and the overall services to the communities and the different communities and minorities that are present. So now, without actually stealing the time to our speakers, I would like to give the floor to three main presenters. And I would kindly ask you to introduce yourself, because I didn't get all your bios, sorry. And I would like to start giving the floor to the chair of the Legislative Committee, of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Mr. Ronald Davis. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Let me check. Can you hear me well? Okay, well, let me start by acknowledging my old friend Hillary Shelton. It's good to see you again, as well as one of the top legislators in our country, Senator Cardin, for both of their outstanding work on police reform. I've had the honor to testify with Hillary and testify in support of the senator's legislation on racial profiling and police accountability. And so it's good to hear from them and see them again. My name is Ron Davis. I am a 30-year law enforcement veteran. I spent 20 years in Oakland, California. I was police chief in the city of East Palo Alto for 9 years. And then for 3.5 years, I served in the Obama administration as director of what we call the COPS office, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. And it's the office that works with the over 16,000 local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies in the United States to help advance community policing. As you are well aware, we have one of the most decentralized policing systems in the world, and that we have over 16,000 independent, locally controlled agencies. Now, I think just in the interest of time, something was said at the beginning of today's session about system imbalance. And I think that's one of the key things that myself, my organization that I'm representing right now with Noble is focusing on, is that we have this system imbalance that we have, or in the US, I'll be a little bit more direct, we are still suffering greatly from structural racism in the policing systems. And my concern as we move forward is that we need to acknowledge that the system is imbalanced. We need to acknowledge that there is structural racism. We need to quit trying to revise history. And especially in the US, we need to acknowledge the role that police have and in many places are still continuing to play in racial inequities and a disparate treatment of communities or societies of color. And until we do that, it's going to be hard to move forward. I think it was Nelson Mandela that said it best, only the truth can put the past to rest. And so one of the things I hope we do is to start with the truth of the role that police have played and are playing based on this system imbalance. The system imbalance is also critical because the more we understand structure and systems, the better we can respond to the deficiencies. And to me, it's the difference between police reform and policing reform. Too often we focus on police reform, which goes after the individual officers, and we focus on the bad apple theory, a bad cop here, a bad cop there, with we're always feeling the need to say the overwhelming majority of cops are good. And we know that. Policing reform is saying that the system is in balance, that there's structural deficiencies to the extent that even good cops have bad outcomes and bad cops get to operate with impunity and can hide in the system and thrive in the system because it's failing to hold them accountable. And so we need to make those kind of changes. There's 3 levels that we need to make these structural changes if we're going to move forward. There's one at the profession level, and a lot of you are talking about that. Whether it's a college of policing, we need to step up policing to be a true profession, to enhance a body of knowledge and standards, to do more research so that it's evidence-based and not anecdotal, not emotional, not knee-jerk reactions to tragedy that occurs, but research and evidence and science. So professionally, we need to respond. We need legislative changes. You know, I'm listening to whether it's the U.S. or even outside, that we need legislative changes to make sure that police are held to the higher standards, whatever of the core values of that community. And then we need community-driven standards where the community is working with the police to hold us accountable. One of the things I think is important, as I perceive forward in my 30-year career, is, as you can tell, as an African-American, is the conflict that sometimes exists when trying to police communities of color, being an officer of color. And I think that conflict has taught me how to respond from a systems point of view. So as a Black man, as a father of Black children, I still have to have conversations with my kids on what to do when stopped by the police, on the out of the fear that they could have an inappropriate encounter, a deadly encounter, despite their best efforts. At the same time, as a cop for 30 years, I've seen our selfless servants put their lives on the line every day. And they're some of the best and most honorable people that I know. So how do you reconcile that conflict? And what I would recommend as we move forward is instead of trying to make them fit into a nice narrative, that we need to acknowledge each for the truth that they represent. Everything to me is going to start with the truth. And the truth is that I still have to have that talk with my son and my daughters. The truth is that policing is still a very honorable profession, but it is suffering from structural racism. And the more we ignore that truth, the more dangerous we have. And so I would say that the truth often hurts, but selective ignorance is fatal. When we selectively decide to ignore our history, selectively decide to ignore racial injustice, structural inequities, it is dangerous and deadly to our democracy or to the governing structure that you're operating in. And I think it goes to that the more we tinker around the edges, the more we do a practice here or a program there, we're not changing structure. We're accommodating for incompetence and we're accepting structural deficiencies. And we need to stop accommodating that. In other words, it's almost sometimes we're saying, well, I can't fix it, so therefore let me build around it. And we need to basically build these systems down to the foundation and rebuild them based on where we're at in the 21st century. I think the fact that we're here, and I applaud the organization for setting this up, that we're having this discussion suggests that we have a unique opportunity, because finally the racial injustice that we're seeing around the world is so loud and so clear and so painful that it's now impacting all of our communities. As Dr. King said, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we know that injustice is basically driving the agenda. Let me just close with this. I think as we move forward, the key that I would say in moving structures and what are good practices in policing is to make sure that the practices goes towards the system. I heard the word diversity a lot today. And understand this, if all you have is good programs to attract diverse candidates, the culture and the system will turn that diverse candidate into the very mechanism that you're trying to change. In other words, the informal indoctrination process will override the diversity. In the US, it's called Blue Lives. The concept that once you become a cop, you lose your ethnicity, you lose your culture, you lose your gender, and versus embracing it, right? If you're a female, then what makes you valuable to the organization is that you have an experience as a woman growing up in this country or whatever country you're from. If you're African American, Black, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. But if you have to give that up to become blue, then what's the value of diversity? So as we start looking at these practices, we need to make sure that the systems and the culture have not already figured out how to override it, so that there's benefit in what we're looking for and there's benefit in moving forward. And I think we do that, then there's a lot of practices out there. There's some great thinking and research and evidence. We just got to build the structure so that we are available to not just say we're implementing them, but to actually change the culture of policing, change the systems so that good cops do have good outcomes, that bad cops are held accountable, and that we are seen as part of the community. If we don't make some of these changes now, we are losing our legitimacy across the board, to the point you're seeing people now want the police departments abolished. And that says a lot to where we're heading. So we have a unique opportunity, and thank you for giving me some time this morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really inspiring, actually. I have to admit that it was really a very good presentation. And actually, your first point about professionalism is something that it's very high on the OSCE agenda. And the Transnational Threat Department is really trying to work in this direction with our participating states, because it's proven that the more professional the police is, and the better service to the community, and whatever community. So I think that this is really something for us also to think even more inside the OSCE. So I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Nick Glynn, Senior Program Officer of the Open Society Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. Just to briefly introduce myself, I was a senior police officer in the UK until I retired from the service after 31 years in 2016. I'm Nick Glynn on Twitter if you want to find out a little bit more. I've been a commentator and activist on and in policing for several decades. I was previously the national lead on stop and search at the UK's College of Policing. We do have one in the UK between 2013 and 2016. I was also the vice president of the National Black Police Association in the UK from 2013 to 2015. I currently lead on policing and related issues at Open Society Foundation's Initiative for Europe, concentrating on the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain, and the UK, although my work takes me in many other places as well, striving to improve policing there and beyond by supporting the brilliant activists and organisations that we work with and support in those countries and as I said, further afield. To the issue at hand, the recommendations from 2006 that the OSCE made are excellent, and I think we do well to ask ourselves, and I'm asking myself, testing questions in our sphere of influence as to how much progress has already been made on them 15 years later. I'm briefly going to cover 4 main areas and issues in policing that I've either worked on or supported during my time in policing and in my subsequent work at OSF. Good practices, conflict prevention and policing, police public relations, and COVID enforcement. The first thing I'd say, that the good practice that stands out to me is neighbourhood policing, is a genuine approach to policing that is rooted in local communities where real relationships with the public exist. The UK example is indeed a strong one. When it's truly embedded, it really works. But you have to promote that role within policing, so it's seen as a specialism, something to aspire to be rewarded and respected, and not seen as a soft option or not real policing, which actually does happen. We could also do with a redefinition for policing of what proactive means. What does a proactive cop do? They don't just give out tickets or stop people, but they should be problem solving, relationship building, investing in people, preventing crime by early intervention, using alternatives to criminal justice solutions, so giving advice, informal cautions, using restorative justice. I think that whole package and that approach to local neighbourhood policing is a good practice that we would do well to see spread further afield. As far as conflict resolution and conflict prevention is concerned, I think we need a standardization of use of force, as the police term it, because of course, if you're on the receiving end of use of force, you're more likely to call it police violence. But it's within our gift. The guidance is already there. The tactics and medical knowledge is already there. In fact, I just tweeted Amnesty International's excellent guide on the police use of force and firearms. We know that chokeholds kill. We know how to avoid them. In the US, we know that the 21-foot rule is not a reason to shoot first and think later. Reviewing the 21-foot rule guideline alone could have a huge impact on reducing the level of police use of force and the fatalities that are linked to them. As has already been mentioned, there has to be accountability as understood by citizens, not as understood by others. Payments by taxpayers to victims' families doesn't exonerate the officers guilty of murder and misconduct. Filming the police at a safe distance is part of accountability in 2020. We should remember that without mobile phone footage, some police officers would have avoided accountability altogether. People who film the police are often criticised for not intervening, but actually filming at a safe distance, not intervening, but just filming, is for some the safest and most community-spirited thing that they can do. We have to resist the militarisation of the police with the rollout of equipment that is more and more repressive, resisting the liberal use of tear gas that is indiscriminate and appears to have some terrible side effects on women, some very recent research shows. Resisting the use of rubber bullets and the other generic names for those kind of weapons that are maybe less lethal, but blind and maim people. The desire to roll out taser is driven by a culture of fear and almost an arms race that is fueled in part by commercial interests. Watch out for Axon Taser, the company behind those weapons, who provide body cams and data storage, and there are commercial pressures for the police to have more equipment. I think the real challenge for policing, though, as far as conflict is concerned, is that they are not at the forefront of conflict prevention on their own. They're not the only solution in town, and community-based initiatives have to be given the opportunity to thrive and indeed sometimes fail, like policing does in crime prevention, as an alternative. And I heard the mention of police abolition, but we do need a deeper understanding of what defund means and what that movement really means. Providing public taxpayer funding and resources to approaches and structures that are not policing is part of the way forward, and it will mean less policing, less police, and fewer, as I term it, moments of jeopardy where the outcome can too often be a fine, a fight, or a funeral. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll maybe skip a little bit quickly through the next couple of things. But in terms of trust building, I would mention some of the projects that we support, like the Policité project in Lyon or the Policing Diversity project in Belgium. As has been said, some of those projects are part of the solution. They break down some barriers. Affinity groups within the police, such as the one that was led by Ramon Arnhem in the Netherlands, the chief of police in the Netherlands, where he led the Caribbean Police Network, but helped to create a number of other networks for different race and religious-based groups in policing, enriches policing, educates policing, and helps them to provide a better service. And let's remember that it is a service. Policing is a service first, and law enforcement is only part of that job. And very quickly then, finally, in terms of what COVID has shown us and the pandemic has shown us, is that people of colour are more often stopped, searched, warned, fined, brutalised, arrested and incarcerated. And all that COVID has done is really exposed that and put it on our screens and on our phones when we've been locked away during the restrictions. And it's exposed the systemic and structural nature of these problems. And we know that there is so much more to do, but maybe it's exposed some of those issues for us to find some intelligent and more productive and more equitable and fair ways forward, so that we can deal with those in the future in a better way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. And actually, you give us, I think, a lot of points to reflect on. And maybe to elaborate a bit on the concept that you mentioned of neighboring policing, what we call community policing in the OSCE. But as I think we really need to stress the fact that community policing, this component, this aspect of the police service is not something that once embedded or integrated in the system, it will function always well in the same manner. So we need really to focus on this specific service, because changes in the system, changing in the law, changes in the management can affect the community policing. And it's not a guarantee that if one participating, say one of the, manages to introduce it, to establish, and to really roll out the concept in their police service, it is guaranteed forever that it will function, because we witness really a lot of challenges nowadays. So thank you very much for highlighting also the concept, because it's really important. And now let me give the floor to Sergeant Marc Labonte from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Denise. I feel a bit naked with such guests, Mr. Davis and Mr. Glynn. I've been a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 35 years, still serving now in Ukraine into a bilateral police mission. My service brought me into the first role, as a police officer, uniform officers, narcotic, international, with 8 years in 4 years in Morocco and 4 years in Turkey as a liaison officer, and also to the intelligence stream of our agency. I would, I totally agree that the main goal of policing, and then since I've been a police officer, for me it was the community. It's community policing. As a police officer, I thought I always believed in that. I always strive to be part of the community, and to be able to to communicate. I think it's our biggest tool that we have as police officers, communication. And as you know, Canada is a fairly large country. The population is not as dense as we have in the United States or the UK or other part of the world. So a lot of the places that we do policing, we are basically it. We are the only person on call or on service. So like I said, my first tool as a police officer always been my mouth. And I think is the best tool that we have in our pocket. De-escalation. I think the community, what we talked about, community policing, with what we call the CCG, the community consultative groups. I think those are very, very important. To bring all the communities, and especially minority communities, into the police realm. We need to have them, express what the problems are. When I think of community policing, also as a organized crime investigator, we think about race, gender, and all of that, but also we have to think about the unique characteristics of organized crime. We need to look at some issues that we need to communicate with them also, not always enforce. We have programs within the RCMP that we talked about with the organized crime, like the Hells Angels, where we will have an officer, being kind of the front line and go talk to the president of those chapters to make the connection so that we can prevent some of these issues that may come up later on in both our worlds. On the national security front, some of our guests have spoke earlier, we have the outreach program team, like the Netherlands, I believe. So where we go and speak to the community, and this is also a great tool that we have to recruit future police officers from these community. I'm not going to go on for because I know we have a few questions that we have been posed, and but I just wanted to give you kind of this statement, and we can talk about the other question from Denise.
So thank you very much. Thank you so much. And I think that when you mentioned this partnership, this kind of trust relation with the community and the citizens is also something really crucial if you want to actually better serve, the communities. And whatever can be used in terms of outreach campaigns or reaching out, establishing even program for youth that we are trying, to support even this involvement of youth and involving schools already with police. I think these are all good examples that we try also to promote. And now I think we have quite a good time for opening the floor for any questions that the participant may have. And I would really ask you to use the chat function because it's easier for me to follow all the questions and then to give the floor to each of you. Thank you. Or if you physically raise your hand, just switch on the camera so that I can see. Sorry? Aha, okay. Go ahead.
This is that was for me. This is Ryan Davis. I was waiting to see if someone had a question, but I do maybe think we can delve a little bit further into something Nick mentioned, which was the area of defunding. And I think like I said, my concern as we move forward is that we don't start addressing some of these systems imbalance as we talked about. And I definitely love the recommendation from 2006. And I think I agree with Nick, they're extremely relevant. We should take stock of it. But if we don't address the systems imbalance now, I think the profession is going to lose its legitimacy across the board. But we also need to understand what the community is telling us. So right now, because we are still making police reform candidly about going after individual officers as the way of getting accountability, which is each officer should be held accountable versus the policing accountability system, this issue of defunding becomes us versus them, right? Even you see from a political discourse versus understanding, someone said earlier today, the need to redefine policing. What is the role of, what does public safety look like in our community? What role does the police play? What role does the law enforcement play? There has to be a way and a necessity to shrink the law enforcement footprint in our communities and to provide services and support for those services that we know have a higher return on our investment for solving the root causes of crime and violence, especially in the US, we have high levels of gun violence. It is much better to invest in those services, whether they're rehabilitation services, drug treatment services, mental health services, than to have an extremely large footprint, law enforcement footprint, so that one of my 25-year-old cops is now settling a mental health issue at 2 o'clock in the morning when the society has failed to even provide those basic services. So once you invest in those services, there is the ability to reallocate funds to sustain that effort, to make sure that when you look at public safety, that law enforcement is not the only person or only entity responsible. And I think the more we understand what the community is trying to tell us with these phrases, the more we can put that towards our transformational process and realize that in many cases we're pretty much saying, and quite often, the same thing.
Thank you. I give the floor first to Mark and then to Nick.
Okay. I agree. I think it's a balance, though, between understanding what defunding the police, means. In my own opinion, I believe that it's a sharing of the resources, whether it's mental health or drug addiction or that type of things. I think police will always be the front line and the first to react to many situations. And then, some of the communities, and I'm sure around the world we have that. I know in Montreal and other large community like Toronto, we have kind of intervention team. So the frontline officers will attend and then find out that, well, this is not a police matter, this is not a criminal matter, but it is a social matter, or it's a medical problem. Then they have the tool of this team with social worker, nurses, or whatever, that will come and then try to assess with the victim or with the person, you know, where should we go next, and where does this person need to be brought to a shelter or to a hospital or to a medical doctor. So I think, you know, I personally, like, I guess I'm biased because I'm still a serving police officer, and I don't want to see the money taken away from us because I think we don't have enough. But I think we need to be more inclusive in the who we have as partners. And I think a lot of it will still be led by the police. But as we mentioned earlier, and as Mr. White has mentioned, being a senior officer of the RCMP, he, like, you know, we will need, you know, to work together and more efficiently with our partners within the community. And that's where the communication and the, like, you know, the role of these community groups will be more important.
Nick?
Thank you. Well, I mean, I'm not serving anymore, but to be honest, this is not thinking just because I'm not serving. I do think we have to question this this thinking that the police respond first and then we maybe look at other interventions later. The risk with that is that it's too late and that intervention is fatal for the member for the citizen, for the police officer. And so, but of course, this is about partnership, and this has to be about taking the police with the whole journey, because, you know, I totally understand the police mentality of 24/7 service. When everybody else has gone to sleep and has stopped working, the police are still there and will go and deal with the most difficult and terrible things. And so, in a sense, there's an education element to this, which is an understanding that actually the first intervention, the police should not always be the first intervention and the first line of defense or intervention in some of these scenarios. Just very quickly on some research that was done in the police force where I used to work, where they trialed a police vehicle that had a police officer and a mental health professional on patrol, and they would get called and go to incidents, and it was seen as successful because you had a mental health professional who knew how to intervene with somebody who was having a crisis. Actually, what the research subsequently showed was the best place for the assessment of who should go and deal was in the control center, and it was much better to have the mental health professional in the control center to then be able to say, don't send a police vehicle, a police resource to this incident because that might inflame it. It's better to do this, send this other community intervention. So I think there's a lot of, you know, learning on all sides as far as that is concerned. And for me, that is the defund conversation. Defund means different things in different places. It has a different meaning and context in the US than it does in certain places in Europe, for instance. Expanding that and digging into that will, I think, help us to get the right approach in the right location.
Thank you, Nick. And indeed, now we have questions from the floor. And I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Grigorian. And please also, if you can specify to which speaker you are addressing the question, or if it's for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear parliamentarians, I have to apologize once again for deviating from the topic, and I need to make a remark. As previously my colleague from Azerbaijan spoke and on the topic of the conflicts, and I simply have to get back to here and say that I'm quoting from what the colleague said from Azerbaijan, liberating the territories. In fact, she did a very direct confession of that. The aggression was unleashed by Azerbaijan towards Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Armenia, basically, and not self-defense, as the official statements from Azerbaijan come from. Speaking about the civilian casualties, I have to say that there are more than 15 killed and more than 17 wounded by now as a result of the aggression started by Azerbaijan allied with Turkey from September 27th. It's the 10th day of hostilities. And as my time is very scarce, I want to speak about actually one very important fact, and I want to draw everyone's attention on this. It's the use of internationally banned weaponry by Azerbaijan, and I'm quoting officially from Amnesty International. So Amnesty International's crisis response experts were able to trace the location of the footage to residential areas of Stepanakert, that's in Nagorno-Karabakh, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh, and identified Israeli-made M095 DPICM cluster munitions that appear to have been fired by Azerbaijani forces. The use of cluster bombs in any circumstances is banned under international humanitarian law, so their use to attack civilian areas is particularly dangerous and will not only lead to further deaths and injuries, said Denis Griboshev, Amnesty International's acting head of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I don't want to take too much time on this, but I want to stress another important aspect is that it is the attacking of journalists, both international and local, covering the conflict that has taken place during the recent days. So 2 journalists from the French Le Monde, both citizens of France, a Russian reporter, and 2 more local journalists.
Ms. Gregorian, I don't want to interrupt you, but we would like also to give the floor to others, and we would like really to focus on the very, the topic of the discussion, which is really police. So,
I'll finish my sentence if I may.
Okay, but please, it's so with respect to other participants. Thank you.
So what is very important to emphasize here is geography of the attacks. The reporters were attacked before reaching Artsakh, before reaching Nagorno-Karabakh, in the eastern region of Gerarkunik in Armenia, and this is very, very important to bear in mind. This needs no further comments, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on these things. The world needs to condemn this and stop the aggression. Thank you.
So I would like to pass the floor now to Ms. Ganelievi. But I don't see.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
I don't see the screen though.
I just
turn on the video.
Yes, I turned on my video. Can you see
very
me?
good. Thank you. Sorry, because we couldn't. I couldn't see you. Sorry, I couldn't spot.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to answer and I would like to reply to what Armenian representative just spoke. First of all, I would like to invite all the participants of this webinar and also the Armenian member of delegation to look at the map of the world, the political map of the world, to see that there is no such an entity which is called Artsakh or whatever the name she gave to it, because the region that the escalation is going on, this is the Nagorno-Karabakh region of the Republic of Azerbaijan, which is part and parcel territory of Azerbaijan, which is internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan and which has been confirmed as the internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan even by the United Nations Security Council, which is the highest security organ of the world, of the United Nations. So that's why it's better for the Armenian delegation before coming and attending this webinar to study the map of the world to see that such illegal entities are out of law. Illegal entities cannot exist for a long time. So Azerbaijan is now liberating its territory. That's right. Azerbaijan is fighting on its own territory. We are expelling the occupant Armenian armed forces, which have been occupying our territories for more than 3 decades. So now Azerbaijani army is engaged in expelling occupant troops from the territory of Azerbaijan. As a member of Azerbaijan delegation, I represent the Azerbaijani IDP community from Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan. I have been expelled from that region. I was born in Nagorno-Karabakh, and for 30 years I have been living internally as an IDP. So my appeal to the Armenian delegation is that we have many times told Armenian community in the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan that we are ready for the peaceful coexistence. But all our calls, all of our appeals
Sorry,
have been
Mr.
rejected.
Ganievi, I have also to ask you, as I did with Ms. Gregorian, if you could actually come to an end, because we would really like, and the organizers also, to give the floor to other participants that have questions on the police work. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I understood, because she went off topic. That's why I had to reply. Thank you very much.
So now I would like to ask all of you to respect the topic of this interesting webinar and seminar that the CNM and the Helsinki Commission organized. And I would like to open the floor to other participants that could have questions. I have one actually for Nick, if anyone has a question. So I go ahead. Nick, in your presentation, you mentioned a few and I liked even the verb, I have to admit, like to resist the militarization of the police and to resist the use of certain weapons. And I'm really wondering, and I ask you, can you elaborate a bit better in the sense what we as international organization can do in this respect? Because this is, you know, these decisions are are basically national decision, and sometimes are not only decision of the executive, of Ministry of Interior, sometimes are this decision taken by Parliament when they imply funds. So how can we actually support in resisting this?
Thank you. Well, I think there's a few things to consider. The first is the law. Some of the weaponry used in policing is unlawful. And indeed, the people who just went off topic did mention sort of weapons that are contrary to international law, the use of them. And tear gas is an example of that. So tear gas is outlawed in military conflict, and yet it is used to on protesters at a Black Lives Matter protest or at a Gilets Jaunes protest in France. And in some places, tear gas is used extensively. I say, you know, it's used like air freshener, the way it is just sprayed on everybody, and used so liberally and so indiscriminately. And there is some recent research, actually, which I will share on social media afterwards if people would like to pick it up, which shows the negative impact that has on women who are at those protests, medical implications. So there's a good reason why those weapons are banned. So why on earth are they being used in policing? So we should ask questions about the law as to what specifically it says, and then the resistance is about challenging that in an organised and comprehensive and strategic way. The second issue, I guess, is the evidence where the law doesn't prohibit the use of a weapon, but where rubber bullets or baton rounds or whatever term is used are fired in a way, are used in a way where they are fired at the ground so that the round spins and is more likely to hit somebody in the face and blind them. And we are seeing, again, this is happening on a regular basis. The evidence we know is there. We have to collect that evidence, collate it. We have to support the people who are victims of these use of weapons by the police, to seek justice, not just for them, but to seek structural change and to question as I think I said in my presentation, the arms race that we are seeing, where policing is becoming more and more militarized. And, you know, we saw on our cinema screens a couple of decades ago RoboCop, and yet that is what some of our cops now look like. And we shouldn't just accept that, because it's not the best way to do policing. It creates barriers that are not conducive to conflict resolution and to de-escalation, which is, of course, what we need where there is conflict.
Thank you. And I'm wondering if Mark or Ronald, you can add something about this. This is, I think, is really crucial, you know?
So this is I agree with what Nick said. I mean, we definitely need to take out the law, but we also need to make sure that we're not inadvertently incentivizing the use of that equipment. So, for example, in the U.S., there was an actual program called the 1033 program, in which local law enforcement agencies could get military equipment just for the asking. And at one point, the policy even suggested that if you didn't use it, you would lose it. So now you have a local law enforcement getting equipment from a theater of war into a local jurisdiction with the direction that if you don't use it, you lose it. So that's when you start seeing the militarization of First Amendment protections as far as protests and demonstrations. So we know that most of this equipment is not needed. There are circumstances, unfortunately, and across the globe in which law enforcement would have to have some heavy equipment. But the militarization of the police is a major problem. And it's not just the equipment; it's the equipment, it's the mindset, it's the idea that we're at war. And as I told some officers, a war unfortunately has things like collateral damage. In our democracy, there is no collateral damage. You cannot accept that kind of knowledge, that kind of thought. And we're not at war in our communities. We should be serving our communities. And any weapons we have is for the protection of the community, not to oppress or to control the community. And so my biggest concern with the militarization is not just that we're getting too heavy-handed, is that we're using it most to oppress certain rights that our citizenry have, whether it's the right to protest against social inequities. And so we need to be very careful to make sure that we're not incentivizing it through the grants, through funding, through legislation, and that we're holding departments accountable at the national level. I think that for the United States, the decision to use tear gas is not a national decision. It can be done by a local lieutenant or sergeant in one of those 16,000 police departments facing a demonstration. And because of that decentralized model, which we embrace the decentralization of it, you can see without national standards, or at least professional standards, we're all over the map. You can cut on the TV, see one agency, and as Nick says, it looks like they're spraying tear gas like air freshener, and then another agency, you'll never see it. So we need to definitely build the base of evidence. We need to make sure that these certain weapons are deemed to be just inappropriate, immoral for a civil law enforcement agency to use.
Thank you, Ronald. And maybe Mark, yes.
Yes, no, I totally agree, and like I'm just going to look at the devil's advocate here on that side, I guess, yeah. But like I think there's a time and use, for all these tools, and this is what we need to teach, and that's where education of our police officers and the community in general comes into a big effect. So we need to make sure from the ground up, from the recruit. That once he's in the car, he needs to be taught that, first de-escalation, and but at the end of the day, sometimes we don't have a choice. You need to use whatever force is necessary. But again, it's on very specific item. With what's going on in the U.S. and we had some in Canada. I guess it's a very unfortunate, and I think it portrays the police as as the bad guy in the whole thing. But we need to have both the community get together and have our leaders come out and speak out and bring everybody together, the police and all the actors in this and what's going on. But at the end of the day, it's educating our police officers, teaching them the community values, what we want them to be, and that we are there to serve. And I think, and I'm speaking for myself and the people I worked with, we were we are there to serve, and then we want that. We want to do a best job that we can. We're lucky, I think, in Canada and in general. We have the Charter of Rights that gives us a path where we have to stand, and the weapons that are being purchased and stuff like that, that we need to really look at it in details, and when we need to use them.
So thank you very much. And I think that we are approaching the end of this session. And if you don't have any other remarks that you want to add, I think with this we can conclude this session. And I would like really to thank you very much for your excellent presentation and the relevant points that you raised. And I hope really we, for sure, at the TNTD and the Strategic Police Matters Unit, we will really take this discussion and your points into consideration. And we hope to continue working with the High Commissioner National Minorities on this specific aspect of police and in diverse societies, and how to really support police services and also how to better serve the communities. And now I would like maybe to give the floor for the closing remarks to Ambassador Lamberto Zanier. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Maybe I should give back to Walter Kemp, to Christoph Kamp for introduce the final session. Or
well, thank you, Ambassador. It's indeed the closing session. We have 10 minutes, and I would like to thank the moderator for keeping us on within the time, because I know that some people will have to leave in 10 minutes. I think it was a very rich debate. I'm happy to make a few comments on it, but Ambassador Zanier, I would like to give you the floor first, please.
Thank you, Christoph, and sorry. I think this was a really interesting debate. It reflected also some of the things I saw as I was traveling in my previous job as High Commissioner. The COPS, for instance, unit in Washington was something was mentioned in our discussions with the Department of Justice, and I think that is a model of something that is useful and perhaps could be replicated in various places. Overall, I think more oversight would be useful, and how to promote that. It's something that maybe it's one of the things we could take away from this webinar and think how that can be stimulated. More broadly, I would say, and I would like to quote someone who was talking about redefining policing. Our societies have changed; they're all more diverse. The global governance is changing. The migration is having an impact on our societies, and it's important that law enforcement adjusts to this situation. So policing needs to evolve, perhaps to be redefined. I would caution that in some parts of this discussion we're talking about policing as of itself, and as an Italian, sometimes when I hear talks about demilitarizing police, I get a bit nervous, because the Carabinieri in Italy are a militarized police unit, but they tend to do a very good job there, and they're useful in that kind of environment, which also shows that you might have different police tools in different situations, and there are different modes of policing. We can't expect to have a single mode applying or a single model apply to the whole of the OSCE space, which is so diverse in itself. But certainly principles are there, and the human rights values have to be respected by the police, and I think this is one of the things we should bring with us. My final points would be again on the issue of let's use this webinar to move things. We have some very good recommendations. We have a number of departments in various places of the organization with different mandates that deal with various aspects of this issue. We have next year the 15th anniversary of the High Commissioner's recommendations, which would be a good opportunity for a focused continuing work on policing throughout the year. So let's use that, and let's use it from the various angles. The parliamentary dimension is one that I mentioned, and maybe certain initiatives are possible. I was mentioning earlier the idea of a supplementary item of to the winter session. Let's see if we can in fact make it happen in coordination with everybody else. But certainly this would be to advance the HCNM principles and promote them across the community, and without maybe or helping HCNM to overcome the constraints that they have in their own mandate. So there are a number of things that we can do. So perhaps this webinar could be the first in either a series or in a number of events or initiatives that would bring together the various players and the civil society and the experts, because we badly need the experts on policing, to look at what are the strategic areas of intervention, how we can promote, but also how we can monitor how countries are in fact adjusting policing, because one thing is discussing among ourselves, the other is to go and check that governments are that action is taken to address the very serious issues that we have found. So from my perspective, I thought this was a very good beginning of that discussion, and I hope there will be a follow-up. And I would like once again to thank the Helsinki Commission and the Office of the High Commissioner for starting this dialogue, and I look forward to continuing it from the perspective of the Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lamberto. And I hear an echo. No, thank you very much, Lamberto. It was, of course, also you who initiated the discussion with the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I remember less than a year ago when we had an event where we had the Chief of Staff, Alec Johnson, participating, is where we started to discuss, and it has, I think, resulted in a really very interesting event. I think the policing recommendations are very interesting for our office, because when we work with national minorities in a number of countries, it's often the police which is sort of the first representative of the authorities which national minorities engage with or interact with. Sometimes they operate more isolated within their own community or isolated in their country, and it's really the police force which is their first contact with not only law enforcement but with the authorities. And this is why the recommendations on policing are so important. I think a lot of issues have been touched upon, recruitment, representation. I really liked your comment, Mr. Davis, on what happens to diversity when you enter the police force. And it touches on also issues related to language and education and participation. How do you maintain that own identity as part of a minority or otherwise community, while at the same time being part of a larger group in society? And so I think this comment of yours resonated very much with me in also the broader sense of our work, where we really try to advise participating states how to find that balance between integration in the society, but at the same time also the society, to make sure that this integration is a two-way process and not a smaller community integrating into a bigger community, but actually two communities trying to integrate. There were issues discussed on training, professional support, engaging with communities, and this is also one of the central messages I took away from, or comment I took away from Mr. Shelton, the importance of trust and integrity, and to build on regular communication, as Mr. Labonte mentioned, but also practical cooperation between police and minorities. So I think a lot of issues have been mentioned. I found it a really very interesting discussion, also because I was very happy with the really interesting contributions from the participants. I hope we can engage with you in one way or the other in the future. As Ambassador Zanier mentioned, this is the start of hopefully the start of a discussion. We would love to reach out and have you part of that continuation of the discussion. We'll see how that we will organize our anniversary event next year. We are planning to have additional events prior to that. Ambassador Zanier mentioned allow me to comment on that a little bit, also the issue of the mandate and the limitations on issues of definition. I think the strength of our recommendations, our guidelines, are very much in the applicability to all diverse societies. And I think, as Senator Ben Cardin rightfully said, the issue of policing, it's a worldwide issue. There's no one is immune for the challenging of policing in interethnic or multi-ethnic societies, and that's true for many issues related to our mandate. So by organizing these kinds of events and other thematic events, we do hope to engage and inspire legislators, policymakers, and then on particular on this issue. And we hope that to the participants, and I would like to thank those who who listened into the conversation. I hope it inspired in your future work. A final word of thanks. A big thank you to Alex Johnson, Chief of Staff of the US Helsinki Commission. Thanks so much for putting this together with us. I would like to thank also my team who put a lot of effort in this. And I would like to thank also the moderators. Alex, you're one of them. And Denise Mazzolani, thank you so much for steering the discussion. I would like the speakers to thank you very much. I hope, as I mentioned to you, that we will find a way to keep engaging with you, because I think you have a lot of lessons we can bring in our future work. And final word of thanks to all who contributed to the discussion by asking questions. And we'll hope to see you in our next events. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.